So without further ado, again, let's give a warm round of applause to our guest, and we can start with Professor Tures. Thank you.
If you are interested, I have about a dozen copies of the paper, so if you want to come on up and get a copy of one at any given time, appreciate that. Don't worry, it's not as, sometimes I've written shorter, sometimes I've written longer. Believe it or not, back in 1997, I first presented on this at a conference known as Peace Science over in Indianapolis, and this had to do with Middle East politics, and I looked at what happened concerning a theory, and it is the diversionary theory of conflict. And so I'll be presenting on that subject and how it deals or how it relates to modern Turkey. And so this is about the former Prime Minister, now President Erdogan, opponents and distraction politics over in Turkey. First off, how many of you have heard of the diversionary theory of conflict? Okay, a couple people have from here. Now, back in the 1990s, you would have heard a lot about it when I first presented on the subject. Because what happened was, most people don't know this, it was a book that was published called American Hero. And anybody ever heard of American Hero? Wow, I'd be impressed if anyone saw it. It did not sell very well, not many people saw about it. Nevertheless, they decided to make a movie version of it. And even that movie, though it had some big names like Dustin Hoffman and Robert De Niro and Woody Harrelson, it still did not sell necessarily as well. There weren't as many people who saw it until about the 1990s when you had some reporters were watching this while they were waiting for a briefing. And suddenly they found out that cruise missiles were heading towards Sudan and Afghanistan, and this was in response to the embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania. Oh, yeah. And so the reporters happened to be watching this movie, and so they called it, or the name of the movie was called Wag the Dog. Yes. Yeah. So now everybody's heard that, and so it became known as the Wag the Dog theory, because when the press, as they were watching this movie, and then they have a press conference about attacks, and you also had Monica Lewinsky scandal was going on, and so they were like, wait a minute, the bug light above the head starts firing on up, the light bulb goes off, and so therefore they're like, wait a minute, I think there might be a connection. And so then in scholarship there was a burst of study of this subject about the diversionary theory, and oftentimes you heard it referred to as the wag the dog hypothesis. So, of course, most of you had you'd seen the movie or so. How many of you have seen the movie Canadian Bacon? Okay, a few of you have. And I showed that one to class. There's a similar premise that United States, right after the Cold War, there's no enemy left to fight. The president, played by Alan Alda, is not very popular. And so they're trying to figure out how to distract the people from domestic problems. And so they engineer a war with Canada. And it's very humorously done. It's done by Michael Moore, and I highly recommend you see it. There's a lot of cameos by famous actors or actresses. I show it to my class. They all love it, just to see everyone fired up about the evil Canadians to the north and how that works. And as crazy as it sounds, we may be seeing some of this. When I visited Atlantic Institute last year, and I was after meeting with several of the scholars down in Savannah at the Georgia Political Science Association, I said, I would love to apply this model or take a look at how this model applies to Turkey. Because just reading what I read of the news, it seemed like we saw some of the activities from Wag the Dog theory were being played out here. And so therefore that's what we're going to look at. President Erdogan's tactics, how he links people he doesn't like at home to people abroad. They're in fact, it's almost like you can call it intermestic tactics. And the idea is not to unite the country like it was in Wag the Dog or Canadian Bacon or American Hero. It's designed to divide the country somewhat along a split, but nevertheless maintain power. Now, where this comes from, Georg Simmel and Louis Kozer there was research published about their work. Simmel wrote much earlier, but Kozer's work, Functions of Social Conflict, in 1956. They identified this in-group, out-group hypothesis. Now, of course, most of you probably know we call it the politics of the sandbox. It goes back to your preschool or kindergarten days. You've got the kids there, they're fighting over some of the toys, and then all of a sudden the poor new kid comes on in, and they decide to unite against the new kid who comes on in. And they build this, the new person coming in as part of the out-group, and they've achieved greater in-group cohesion. So therefore, this kindergarten class is divided until they can pick on an outsider. And so therefore, the idea would be that, as it was applied, that new leaders would have an incentive to distract the public from problems. Because whenever a new leader comes on in, every year they talk about the honeymoon period. The honeymoon period seems to be getting shorter and shorter. There are a lot of demands and pressures on new leaders. New leaders make mistakes. And so they have incentives to distract people by picking on other individuals. Plus you have this rally around the flag effect. What happens is whenever, let's say, a country declares war, like when the United States goes to war with Iraq, it's on CNN, it's on Fox, there's a lot of patriotic emblems. People start waving the American flags, they work American flags into almost everything, and it's called the rally around the flag effect, and that's what you're trying to get. This is under traditional diversionary theory, traditional rally around the flag effect. Now, what happened was, of course, wars are very costly and very expensive, and they cause, we wouldn't be here if they didn't cause problems, right? I mean, it's a peace building conference. And so that has to be taken into account. What happens is, most of the times, this diversionary theory of conflict has been applied to just about every Anglo-American situation. But few people looked at diversionary theory to non-British prime ministers or non-American presidents. They never tended to look at anyone else. Not only that, they didn't tend to find a lot of support for this hypothesis. So the interest in diversionary conflict kind of died out in the late 1990s after a couple of years, early 2000s, when the people who run the statistics just couldn't find any evidence for it. I'll do the same thing. Now, the classic diversionary theory is that you unite a country with a foreign war. And when I researched that subject over in Indianapolis back in 1997, I also didn't find a lot of empirical support for that. But what I did find was that you tend to see an intent to divide the country with actions short of war. Militarized interstate disputes, threats, mobilizing forces, moving to the border, an occasional limited incursion, as we saw Turkey do not long ago in Syria. Not a full-scale war. Now, when you look at the problem that way, all of a sudden the board lights up and everybody can see a lot of this diversionary theory of conflict. I've also applied it not only to studying the Middle East from World War II, the end of World War II to the present, Iraq, both governments, Alawi and then al-Malikis, Ahmadinejad's regime, and also Libya and Yemen. So I've done these studies throughout the Middle East, and you tend to see a pattern in all of this new modified diversionary theory. Now, inevitably, some people will say, well, wait a minute, you're coming up with a different theory. Well, here's what happened. I had some people that said, well, you gotta, where's this theory? Where's your empirical support? You have to go back to Kosher. And I went back to Kosher's work, and if you actually read Functions of Social Conflict, rather than everyone else's footnotes, you actually see that he says, this is what you can expect. He never says this is going to lead to war. He never says that this is about uniting. People just took the movie and went with that. When you actually read Kosher's work, you'll be like, oh my gosh, this modified diversionary theory is what Kosher was talking about in the 1950s. This is what we could expect. So we should have seen that movie. Brett, I'm sure most of the people in the audience here will know about the Gezi Park protesters. I had my students and I were going through LexisNexis, we were going through a lot of Access World News, and we went through all the information we could. And we tried to look not just at these events, but to see whether government officials were tying them, domestic rivals, to a foreign source. And so somehow the Gezi Park terrorists, or excuse me, they were protesters, but he called them terrorists on repeated occasions. And so we found some cartoons where Somebody's like, save our park, and they're like, you must be some subversives, from the West or from somewhere else in the Middle East. Linking domestic rivals to Israel. And so with this Mavi Mara incident, this was the one where you had, IHH I guess has some connections to Hamas. They tried to run an Israeli blockade. Israel sent in special forces, dropped them in from helicopters, very Hollywood. But then, nevertheless, it wasn't Hollywood in the sense that people died on the ship fighting with the Israelis. The Israelis were armed with guns and the protesters were not. But nevertheless, Erdogan tried to use the incident to tie this to the Gulenists, and others tried to say, every time that he had called for interfaith dialogue, connections between Muslims, Christians, and Jewish people, they would say, look, see, you're basically an agent of the Israelis, and you're like this hated rival that killed several Turks. And the irony is, by the way, I should, if I could go just one back up, is that in this cartoon they were pointing out on a number of occasions, some of the local news reports were saying that Erdogan criticizes Israel by day, and by night or something, or when no one else is looking, he's soliciting things from Israel. So Israel could be the boogeyman by day, and at night something else. It would almost be like on the Iran deal, if you had Republicans who were saying, oh, Iran is really bad, and at night they're trying to buy up stock in Iranian oil companies. Saw limited Turkish raids into Syria. That was over, I guess that was somebody from the Ottoman Empire, special team.
Before the Ottoman century.
Yeah, even pre-Ottoman Empire. And the idea was, okay, well, we're going to do something on this, and it kind of plays to nationalism. It plays on concerns about what's going on in Syria. Now, Erdogan's opponents have also tried to point out that Erdogan has connections to an Al-Qaeda supporter, and that's what triggered a lot of this December 17th movements. And as they're pointing out, Turkey's doing very little to stop the ISIS issue. It seems to be a very fluid border. How is this different? I mean, it's not just one group's press going against the other. We have daily reports of people who come from all over West Europe or in America trying to join ISIS by going through Turkey. That could be something along the lines. What are the implications of all of this? I mean, on one hand, you could say, well, that's good. This isn't leading to war whenever we have this domestic cheap talk, so it must be okay. Well, I mean, we've seen examples of this cheap talk done by leaders. Witness Iran, talking about wiping Israel off the face of the earth, and that leading to an increase in sanctions, more tensions in the Persian Gulf. So you may think it's cheap talk, but in fact, this may lead down the road to future conflict, even over some other issue. It kind of poisons the well, so to speak, leading to regional instability. The important thing is to recognize what it is, to counter such talk, to point out evidence. I think that's what people are going to talk about. The interfaith dialogue to show what it's worth. Probably the best arguments against it are to show, like for example, Erdogan demonizing Israel by day, working with them by night. That seems to be some of the best solutions to the problem. In the case of Iran, you had a lot of saber rattling, or so they would call it, waving the sword or so, to point out what the Iranian Revolutionary Guards were doing by night, which is very different. Was a way to undermine the Ahmadinejad regime and lead to a change. Now a more moderate leader is in there for Iran, and there's better prospects for peace between the world and Iran. I mean, I didn't think we'd have a nuclear agreement before this talk, but we can comment to say that that's a positive element of people opposing Ahmadinejad's divisive talk that he had in the country.